to Piano Lesson number 25. Today we're basically going to be having a little history lesson. I'm going to explain the different periods of music, or I guess you could call them eras as well. Sort of explain what they're about, tell you about the prominent composers and what the style characteristics for each of these eras is. Now you might be asking yourself, well, why is this important? Well, here's some answers. Well, one, it's sort of interesting to kind of know where music started and how we got to where we are. And another really good reason, probably the most important reason for knowing music history is when you're trying to play a piece from a certain era, you need to understand what the composers were going through at that specific time. Like, if you're going to play a Bach piece, you have to be able to know what was happening in that time, what instruments they were playing on, and what was expected, and why do you play things in a certain way. Each era has its own distinct way of being played. Like an example would be, in Baroque music you cannot use rubato unless you are doing it at maybe the end of a cadence point at the very end of a piece. But you cannot use rubato at all in a Baroque piece, but you go to a Romantic piece and you can use it wherever. So that's just a tiny little example. It's very important that you get the right interpretation in each piece, and the only way you can do that is if, one, you have a teacher that knows history like the back of their hand so that they can do that for you, or you know it yourself. So if you know what's going on in the history, then you can put that into your pieces, and then that'll give them a more authentic and historical sound to them. So that'll help you get better marks, that'll help you sort of improve yourself as a musician, because then you can learn all these different styles and be more well balanced. So anyway, let's get into it. So the first era we're going to talk about is the Baroque era. Okay, let's start. Alright, so the first era we're going to talk about is the Baroque era. Now this was a time period between 1600 AD and about 1750. Now, something to basically remember here is that there's two major things in Baroque music at what was going on. Basically, there's very much focus, there's a lot of focus on using your brain, as like mind was very high, like they wanted to use intelligence. Intelligence was very well respected, I don't know. They put a lot of thought into their music, okay? There are many rules to follow, you had to do things a certain way. Now at the same time, the other thing that was happening was there's huge influence by like the Catholic churches and stuff like that. So that most of the music that was being made was made for the churches, and there was very little secular music in these days. It was mainly commissioned by like these composers mainly were commissioned by the churches. Like Bach himself, he was an organist and whatever for different churches. I think the St. Thomas Cathedral is one, or the St. Thomas Church, I can't remember exactly. But anyway, the church was a huge influence, and that's where they got their money basically. That's who commissioned their works. So that's one of the things you have to be thinking about, is the church and attention to high intellect. Now, another thing that they used to do this whole high intellect thing was they used something called polyphony, or whatever. No, it wouldn't be polyphony, it would be polyphony, or polyphonic writing. Now, what poly means many, phonic is voices or whatever, musical melodies. So basically what's happening here is their whole idea is, be complex, be intellectual. So they would have what was called counterpoint. Where they would have like one melodic line going up here, and then another one, or whatever. And counterpoint is basically, you take two melodies, and then you have, it's like harmony, and it's hard to explain. Basically, counterpoint would be you writing two melodic lines, and each melodic line is trying to say something else, say something different, but at the same time, they sound nice together. So it'd be like if someone was saying, I'm going to the store, and the other person's like, could you open a door? You're like, it kind of rhymes, but they're saying two different things. You go to the store, open a door. Anyway, it's not rhyming because music doesn't rhyme, obviously, but that's kind of the idea. The harmonies are matching. They're saying two different things, but like it sounds good together, but it's saying two different things. It's like going off. It's having two ideas that simultaneously will coexist together. That's what counterpoint is. And polyphonic writing is basically writing many of these voices together. So when you're playing your music, you have to be highlighting the main theme. Usually there's a subject and an answer. Or a subject and a question, whoops. No, question and answer. What am I thinking? I'm getting all mixed up right now. Anyway. So what's happening is they'll have like, usually in later Baroque music there'll be a theme. Like, you'll have like that, right? And then later on, the left hand, like this will come in, like, then the left hand will be. So what I would do is look up some Bach fugues. I think that's F-U-G-U-E. That's how you spell a fugue. So if you look up that, that's kind of interesting. There's many voices going on. And you want to listen and highlight the key voice. Okay, so that's polyphonic writing is many voices. The stuff that we have right now is more, it's called homophonic, or basically what it means, it's one voice. So you know how you have a lot of music today where there's one melodic line, like you have the singer and she's like, ah, 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 or whatever. And she goes along and does her little thing, or, you know, guy. But there's one melodic line that you listen to, and then the rest just kind of fills in and it just accompanies and makes that one thing sound better. Whereas polyphony is more like any one of them you could listen to, but they're supporting each other at the same time. So it was much more difficult to write in a lot of ways. And it's kind of cool to listen to because every time you listen to the song, you can always hear something different if you choose to. You can be like, oh, I'm going to listen to the left hand this time, or I'm going to listen to this. So there's it's really rich, and there's lots of levels where you can listen to your music. Now, the most popular composer in this era, most important, was a guy named J.S. Bach. And he was born in, I think, 1685, and he died in 1750. Now, I want you to notice something. Bach died in 1750. When did the Baroque era end? 1750. When Bach died, they just considered the Baroque era finished, basically, because he was that important. And most composers like Beethoven, Chopin, like those guys, they admired Bach very, very much. Probably in all of history, Bach is probably the most talented musician you could ever imagine, like genius-wise. Like Mozart was up there too, but Bach was just wow. Very, very intense. He was born in Germany, and he had quite a few kids. And one of them, C.P.E. Bach, went on to go on to compose as well. And yeah. So Bach was famous basically for his church music, his fugues. Well, not so much as church music. I guess Handel did more of that. There's another guy named Handel, and he was probably the other bigwig in the Baroque era. Those were the two main ones. Bach was number one, and Handel was also up there too. And he wrote a lot of church music, like Hallelujah, Hallelujah, Hallelujah. That song was made by Handel, or Handel's Messiah. Handel wrote a lot of church singing music. They're called oratorios. And Bach wrote a lot of keyboard works. He embraced something called, I think it's equal temperament. Okay? Now, back in the day, before they had this, they were using church modes, where you'd go from... So it's like, you know, Dorian, Phrygian, Mixolydian. I don't know if I explained that already. I think I did. Anyway. But... if I haven't, I'll check and I'll do a lesson on that, but I'm not going to get into that because that's a whole other topic. Anyway, so church modes were being used, and then they developed something called the major-minor tonality, and that is what we're using today still. And Bach was one of the first to adopt it. So before they had an absolute, what was it? It was a way of tuning it. It's a temperament, so there's equal temperament, and then, it's escaping my mind. It's like absolute temperament or something like that. But basically what absolute was is everything was exactly tuned. And the way they tune it is based on intervals like math fractions. So fractions, and fractions that sound good to our ears. So they tuned it exactly to the right spots. But the problem is, when they did that, then other keys were out of tune with another key. So like C major would be perfectly in tune, right? But then if you went to like A flat major, it was slightly out of tune because it was so in tune there. So what they did is they evenly spaced every single note evenly. And when they did that, they made some intervals slightly off tune, very slightly off tune. But what they did is they rounded out the whole thing because they couldn't achieve a perfect temperament without having something out of tune. So what they did is they just equaled it all, and then they had a major minor tonality. So basically the tonic of each key, so there's a C major and a C minor and a D major and a D minor, and the tonic of that key was basically the center. So Bach wrote something called the Well-Tempered Clavier, and it's probably think of it as like the Old Testament of the Bible for music. It contains 48 preludes and fugues in 2 books, and it has every single key. And he wrote a prelude and a fugue for every single key in existence that just came into a thing. So he's like, oh, look at all these new keys. So he composed a song for each key. Cool, eh? So if you want to study something, like improve yourself, once you get up to a certain level, because some of those songs can be pretty hard, like their ARCT level, like way, way up there. ARCT is the highest level in Canada, by the way. So you could try playing through that, or find a couple. You could find the books and look through them and just study them and see. They're really, really good for improving your technique and everything like that. So I'd go through those. Anyway, that's Bach, and there's Handel on there. So that's mainly the Baroque era. Now, some of the style characteristics of Bach is they like to contrast fast and slow, and they also like to contrast like legato versus staccato and loud versus soft. Now you have to realize that the instruments that they had back then, they didn't have the piano, so to say. They had the clavichord and the harpsichord and stuff like the dulcimer, and they had like a very, very beginning piano, but it wasn't really to the same standards. So they actually didn't have foot pedal. Eventually, the first foot pedal was actually a knee pedal, where you had to push up your knee up on top of the piano, like underneath, right under the keyboard, you pushed your knee up. And then they changed it to a foot pedal later. But basically, the piano back then, well, what was played, the harpsichord, you couldn't sustain a note, you couldn't do this, because it would die off really quickly. It was a harpsichord that they mainly used, and it would have a little pluck, and it'd go bling, it had a little hook, and it'd pluck the string. It was actually a quill. And it plucked the string, and it didn't sustain very long. So what you end up having in Baroque music is a lot of quick notes, like very running note. Like that, right? So you've got a lot of running notes. Anyway, so you need to basically study Baroque music with that in mind. Now, moving right along, since we don't have a lot of time here, we're going to get into the classical period of music. Now, this was a period of time from about 1770-ish to 1825. Now, notice how it starts in 1770. There's actually a little tiny gap in between the Baroque and the classical, which was kind of like a transition period, and that was more obscure. It's not usually generally referred to, but the technical name for it is called the Rococo period. Which kind of reminds me of chocolate cocoa, and that makes me want to have chocolate. Woohoo! Anyway, but one of there were other composers, but one of the main composers in this era was Bach's son, C.P.E. Bach. He wrote a piece called, it's in grade 8 actually, for piano in Canada. This one, I can't remember how it goes now. No, it's called solfeggio, something like that. Anyway, it's a long time ago. I haven't done that in, 7 years now? Can't remember it. But anyway, Okay, so there was a short little period of time, and it's sort of a rebellion from the old ways of Baroque music that had dominated the last, 150 years of music. So they decided to move away from polyphonic writing and go towards homophonic, which is the one voice. So you had accompaniments coming in, so the left hand had more of an accompaniment role. They would give you chords or octaves or whatever to play. And things like rests became more important. Like rests were really big. Like they would use rests to create effect. They would also do things, now they had regular pianos were coming into effect. They still weren't fully developed, but by the Romantic era they were. Anyway, but in this time they started playing around with things like crescendos, so building emotion, sort of, like building drama. And here in the classical era, basically, is like the classical and the Rococo are sort of the same. The Rococo was just a transition period. It's like they had ideas, and then the classical period was more playing with those ideas more fully developed. So they had things like the sonata form, sonata allegro form. They started developing bigger forms of music, because back in Baroque times they only had like binary, ternary, rounded binary, asymmetrical. Like it was all very structured. But in like the newer, like classical music, the newer era that came in after that is they came up with like scherzos, which are like jokes, or like minuet and trios, and sonata allegro form, stuff like that. They're expanding and getting into big works. Like some of these works were like symphonies that lasted like an hour or whatever. And basically they developed this pattern where they'd have a first movement and it was fast and it built a lot of energy, and then the second movement was slow and people would kind of relax and reflect. And then the third movement was usually quite fast as well, usually with renewed pace and vigor, and then it'd build up to this climax at the very end. And that's pretty much how it went. So each movement had its own kind of mood. So it's like the mood of the movement, so to say. So they had 3 different moods for the piece, and then the whole thing came together into one big idea, so to say, you could say. Usually there's 3 movements, but in Beethoven's later works, he created 2 movement sonatas, and they even created 4 movement. Like Chopin wrote a 4 movement sonata. But anyway, that's getting ahead of myself. Anyway, so those are some of the things. Now, in classical music, you should stay relatively steady, quite steady in my opinion. Rubato still wasn't very big at this point. So don't use rubato. Pay attention to your rests. Use dynamical swelling. Don't ever bang. Try to don't bang the piano. Try to create an elegance, beauty kind of a sound out of it. Everything should be very steady, articulated, very clean. It's pretty hard style to pull off, actually. It requires quite a bit of skill. You can't fumble around the piano. It's very very nice. I really enjoy playing classical style. Very nice. So, some of the big composers in this era were Mozart. Mozart was one. I'm sure most of you know about him. He was a child prodigy. He was, when he was like 8 years old, he was getting carted around, going and playing to royal families and whatnot. He was composing at an early age, and he's probably, out of all the composers, he had probably the most natural talent. Like melodies would just come to him, and he'd just write without a single mistake, and it'd just be boom, new piece. So he had lots of talent. He just had a gift. And then he wrote some plays and whatnot, but not plays, operas. But probably the most important figure in the classical period was the guy that actually helped move it to the Romantic era, and his name was Beethoven. Most of you should probably know Beethoven as well. He was not deaf his whole life, though. He actually had hearing, but then he apparently had ear infections and had his ears boxed, and he had an abusive dad, and he went through life he had a painful life, and he's pretty short. I don't think he had much, luck with the ladies. There's times where he'd write a song for a girl, and then she'd reject him. I don't know why they would do that, but, well, I guess I do know. He's kind of a interesting character. Apparently one time he was standing on a balcony out of his apartment on a really busy street, completely naked. Oh, that would be quite funny. Anyway. But yeah, so that was one of the things he did. Beethoven wrote some symphonies, he wrote piano works. Now the thing is, he lost his hearing more later on in his life. And if you listen to his music when he first started, he conformed to the rules of classical music. He kind of just conformed. And then as he got older and he experienced more pain, his pieces became more emotional, and he's like, I just don't care anymore, kind of thing. Like, he didn't care what people thought. I mean, he was going deaf, and he just decided to write for himself, I guess. Like, he just expressed his anger. He didn't have any outlet for it, so he just put it into his music, and then that was a whole new thing for people. Like, no one had ever heard of that, right? Like, making music that personal. So his later works were really crazy, like really crazy compared to his earlier works. His later works were very, angry or sorrowful or sad or lonely, and they had big, huge contrasting mood swings all the time, and people just ate that up and found it very intense. Now, some of his really later works, people have a very hard time digesting because they're so crazy. But anyway, they're all really good, and basically what he did in his time, he died, and about 5,000 people or so attended his funeral, so he was very popular. He was sort of like the first rock star in music, if you want to call him. Beethoven the rock star, yeah. Anyway, so what he did helped pave the way for the more individualistic approach, so thinking about yourself and what emotions you had and expressing your sadness or happiness or whatever. Sort of like taking what's inside you and putting it into the music instead of just writing what you thought people would want to hear. That's sort of the difference. Sort of like how we've gone in TV from watching sitcoms to reality TV. Reality TV is more individual based, right? More real. And like Baroque Era music could be compared to the first TV shows, like the ones like in black and white, like I Love Lucy and everything is very, it was like really like way too happy, right? And then it went more into like elegant TV styles and stuff like that. Anyway, but I find that the music trend and the TV trend is actually pretty similar, except music is ahead because we've had it longer. So TV is sort of behind what is going through music. Anyway, so yeah, when we're playing classical music, we need to be very steady, really elegant and stuff like that. Now let's get into the Romantic Era. Okay, the Romantic Era. It started in about 1820 and it lasted until about, 1900 or so, something like that. Now in the Romantic period, you can expect to use a lot of rubato. So you can use, rubato means you can alter the time, sort of. You can take away time. It's like robbed time. That's what rubato means, robbed time. And you can sort of stretch out the beautiful moments, so to say. Now you can't use gobs and gobs and gobs of rubato. You can still only just use a little bit because it still wasn't super, super popular. You're still following a basic time, sort of like keeping steady, but then adding a little bit of rubato here and a little bit there and a little bit there and a little bit there. They're using rests, they're using a lot of ornamentation, so lots of trills, turns, stuff like that. They're using tons of all that stuff. What else were they using? They're sort of trying to become emotional, like just seep into the music. That's what they're trying to do with romantic stuff. So what you've got to do when you play a romantic piece is try to connect with the music, feel it inside you, try to bring in whatever emotion the piece is trying to feel. Like a nocturne would be kind of soft and quiet, so you could picture relaxing and just reflecting on yourself. Now, something you have to take into account is that the people back in this time had lots of time on their hands to listen to music. Like they had all day to just listen to it. It was something like a highlight of their day. It wasn't something they just did to fill in a 5-minute gap or whatever before they went to Starbucks and got a latte. Anyway, so basically with romantic stuff, you want to take your time with it, really enjoy it, do lots of voicing, bring out the melodic lines. It's very homophonic. Like there's usually just an accompaniment in the left hand and then one single melody. And it's very, very emotional and personal. So try to make it personal to yourself. what you'll find a lot of the time is you'll have a wider range of dynamics now. You'll have like really big fortes, very soft sounds, and it's just a really nice period of music. It's probably my favorite. And my favorite composer was actually in this period, which is Chopin. And Chopin is actually the most played composer of all time in all of piano. Like every year, Chopin pieces are the most performed in piano. He added something called chromaticism, which is using notes that, like using passing notes, like basically you've got your diatonic scale, and then he would use notes outside of the scale, like that are chromatically related or whatever, and get to another note that is in that scale. It's sort of like, say you wanted to go to here, from here to here in the scale. So he would maybe do like that. So there's a lot of using notes that are outside of what that scale would normally have. So it was sort of expanding that, except Chopin was way better than I am. And his stuff fits under the fingers really well, but you know, there's Schumann was also in the Romantic period, and he was really good as well. And yeah, like when you're playing Romantic stuff, you just want to get into basically the personal feeling. That's what I can explain the best. And you don't be afraid, sort of free yourself. Romantic stuff should feel a bit more freeing, whereas Baroque stuff should feel sort of like you're in chains, and classical stuff is like you get to walk around your house, but you're not allowed to go outside of it, so you're still trapped a little bit, but you have a bit of freedom. And then we get into the next era, the Impressionistic era, and it basically it's an era that was more devoted, instead of looking at yourself, try to look at, okay, take for example, you go to an arts thing, and it's the people that stand and look at a painting and go like, oh, this apple fills me with a great desire to express my food cravings in a very happy, organic way. I don't know. But it's like looking at something and what does it make you feel? Like, what does the painter's brush strokes tell you? How does it make you feel inside? And just what's the feeling that you're getting from this? So now Impressionistic stuff isn't about like taking what's inside you and putting it on there. Now Impressionistic was, what do you feel when you look at a tree blowing in the wind? What do you look at when you see a calm water? What do you see, a calm water pond, and you see the reflection? Or what do you see when you see misty clouds or tall mountains, stuff like that. So that's what Impressionistic was. And the main composer here would be Debussy. He's a French guy, and yeah, he did a lot of stuff. Now, like, they're getting really free. There's lots of rubato, enjoying all the moments, and they do stuff like not resolving things that used to have to be resolved. Like before, you would have to resolve a tritone. Now you don't have to. They're breaking just rules left, right, and center. They're putting parallel octaves together and all these things. You know, using whole tone scales and chromatic scales and all this crazy stuff, and modulating all over the place and doing lots of chromaticism. And it's sort of like the Romantic era's rules, but added on even more. And it just really, really flowing, beautiful music sometimes, are pretty ugly. It really depends on what kind of piece you're listening to and if you have that kind of taste. But yeah, so that's the Impressionistic last era that we usually play. And there's also jazz, of course, but that's even later. But before that, then there's the 20th century style, which basically breaks even more rules, and basically they kind of got to the end of music and they're like, okay, where do we go from here? So they got to a point where they didn't know where to go anymore. So then a whole bunch of people just started going in individual directions, and they would go all over the place. They would just do, you know, some guy would do tone rows, some guy would like retune his piano, so he has a quarter tone piano, so you know, from here to here isn't semitone anymore, it's actually a quarter tone. Right? So it's just crazy stuff. Like really crazy, like tone rows, like taking like 12, like all the keys and stuff like that. Like then there's stuff where like you take this top thing off and you like, you know, like pull the strings out like that, and you just have to like hit certain strings, and it just goes all crazy from there. One of my favorite 20th century composer is a guy named Samuel Barber. He writes some really beautiful stuff that's still lyrical, but at the same time still sounds 20th century. So you've got a lot of weird chords in 20th century music, like this could be a chord, right? They're just trying to experiment with different colors and different brush strokes. So if you think of the chords that they're doing, instead of sounding bad, just think, oh, they sound different. Like, oh, you know, what used to be black was bad before, now it's just a color. It's just a different color, that's it. It's just a different color that we can paint with. So that's sort of the whole idea of 20th century music, is trying to experiment with the differences. And so modern music now that you'll hear on the radio actually reflects more Baroque and classical stuff. It's not really anything new at all. They're just taking what's already been made and they're just putting in different vocal instruments and whatnot. That's it. And they're just, you know, adding a drum beat and looping it around. It's very non-complex, like what they're doing. Like what Bach did before was a billion times more complex than anything anyone's wrote since then. Everyone looks at Bach and they're just like, whoa, good stuff. Oh yeah, one last thing. I forgot to put in the romantic section that Chopin wrote it's sort of like the New Testament, because I told you about the Old Testament. And Chopin wrote preludes, a book of preludes. And he wrote the preludes sort of as a tribute to Bach's preludes and fugues. So he wrote a whole book of preludes, so you can look that up as well. Anyway, so that's an overlook, and I'm sure I've gone way longer than I was supposed to with this. So yeah, that is a history for you. When you're playing Impressionistic and 20th century, you can just feel free to do basically whatever you want and what's written in the music. As you go further down the line, you'll see more and more instruction on what the composer wanted you to do. And the newer it goes, probably the more you need to listen to those instructions. Okay? If it's really old, chances are an editor wrote that in, not the actual composer, but the newer stuff, the composer probably wrote it in, so you should look at it and pay attention to it. Okay, so that was a lot of talking and that was a lot of history, and my mouth or throat is kind of sore from all that talking. Anyway, so hope you guys enjoyed that, hope you found that interesting and learned something from that. And yeah, I hope you guys keep going on in music and use this information to improve your playing, and maybe you can experiment with all these different pieces in all these different areas. Okay, take care guys, bye-bye.